"This girl doesn't belong in first class." The white woman's voice cut through the quiet hum of the aircraft like a knife. The entire cabin turned to stare as this perfectly manicured woman, dripping in designer jewelry and radiating entitlement, pointed an accusatory finger at the confused teenager. The young girl, Jasmine Robinson, slowly removed her headphones, her eyes wide with bewilderment. She had never experienced anything like this before in her sheltered years of life. I don't understand what I did wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling as passengers began pulling out their phones to record the unfolding drama. What happened next would shock everyone on that flight and eventually millions of viewers around the world. But before we get to that incredible twist, if you stand against discrimination, hit the subscribe button, type justice, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. You will definitely get a heartwarming reply from us. Jasmine Robinson was not your typical black girl. She came from extraordinary wealth, but her parents had worked hard to shield her from the harsh realities of prejudice and discrimination. This was her very first time flying alone. Usually she traveled with family or their private security detail. She was returning home to Chicago from her prestigious boarding school in Connecticut, where she was one of the top students, despite being one of the few black faces in a sea of privilege. Across the aisle stood Stephanie Blackwood, a woman who represented everything wrong with inherited privilege. At 42, she had lived her entire life believing that her family's old money gave her the right to control who belonged where. Her grandmother's trust fund had funded her lifestyle, her grandfather's connections had opened every door, and her sense of entitlement had grown with each passing year. The trouble began just 30 minutes into the flight, when Stephanie Blackwood returned from the bathroom and noticed something that made her blood boil. There, in seat 2A, sat a young black girl with noise-canceling headphones, completely absorbed in what appeared to be an advanced economics textbook. Stephanie stood in the aisle for a full minute, staring at Jasmine with undisguised disgust. In her mind, this was an invasion of her sacred space, a violation of the natural order she had been raised to believe in. First class wasn't just a seating section to Stephanie, it was a sanctuary for people like her, people who belonged in positions of privilege and power. She approached Jasmine's seat with the confident stride of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. Standing directly over the teenager, she cleared her throat loudly, expecting immediate attention and deference. When Jasmine didn't respond, still lost in her studies with her headphones on, Stephanie's irritation escalated to outright fury. She tapped aggressively on the armrest of Jasmine's seat, making enough noise to disturb other passengers. Jasmine looked up, pulling one earbud out with a polite smile. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did you need something?" she asked with the genuine courtesy her parents had taught her. Stephanie's voice was cold and commanding as she delivered what she clearly believed was a reasonable request. "Yes, I need you to gather your things and move to your proper seat in economy class. There's obviously been some kind of mistake with the seating arrangements." Jasmine blinked in confusion, looking down at her boarding pass and then back up at Stephanie. "I'm sorry, but I don't think there's been a mistake. This is seat 2A, and that's what my ticket says." She held up her boarding pass helpfully, as if she thought Stephanie might have genuinely confused her for someone else. "Listen, sweetheart," Stephanie said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I don't know how you ended up with that ticket, but this section is for passengers who have paid the appropriate fare. Economy class is toward the back of the plane." The confusion on Jasmine's face was heartbreaking to witness. She had genuinely never encountered anything like this before, and her sheltered upbringing had left her completely unprepared for someone questioning her right to exist in a space where she belonged. "But I do have a first-class ticket," Jasmine said softly, her voice beginning to waver. "My parents booked it for me. I'm flying home from school." Stephanie let out a laugh that was pure venom. "Your parents? And what exactly do your parents do that allows them to afford first-class tickets for their children?" The question was loaded with implications that Jasmine was too innocent to fully understand. She answered honestly, the way she had been raised to respond to adults. My daddy works really hard. He has an important job that helps families travel safely. I'm sure he does, Stephanie replied with mock sympathy. But sometimes people get tickets they can't actually afford. Or there are charity programs that give out upgraded seats. Either way, you need to move to where you actually belong. Jasmine's eyes began to fill with tears as the hostility in Stephanie's voice became impossible to ignore. I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? I can call my parents if there's been some mistake. The only mistake, Stephanie said, raising her voice so other passengers could hear, is allowing children who clearly don't belong in first class to take seats away from paying customers who have earned the right to be here. Other passengers were now turning to watch the confrontation, some pulling out their phones to record what they assumed would be entertaining drama. Jasmine looked around desperately, hoping to see a friendly face or someone who might help her understand what was happening. It was at this moment that flight attendant Lisa Patel hurried over, initially responding to what sounded like a passenger dispute. When she saw a teenager in tears being confronted by an angry adult, her maternal instincts kicked in immediately. Is there a problem here? Lisa asked, positioning herself protectively near Jasmine's seat. Stephanie turned to Lisa with the expectant air of someone accustomed to having authority figures take her side. Yes, there's definitely a problem. This girl is sitting in first class, and she clearly doesn't belong here. I need you to resolve this situation immediately. Lisa looked at Jasmine's boarding pass and checked her tablet. Ma'am, this passenger has a valid first-class ticket. Everything appears to be in order. That's impossible, Stephanie snapped. Look at her. Does she look like someone who can afford to fly first class? There's obviously been some kind of error in your system. The racism in Stephanie's words was becoming impossible to ignore, and Lisa felt her protective instincts strengthen. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to return to your seat. This passenger has every right to be here. For a moment, it seemed like Lisa's professional authority might end this nightmare before it went any further. But Stephanie Blackwood wasn't satisfied with this answer. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against her designer handbag as she shook her head dismissively. This is obviously wrong, she declared with the authority of someone who had never been told no in her entire privileged life. There has to be some explanation for this situation. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of cash, counting out bills with deliberate slowness. Listen, she said to Lisa, lowering her voice but speaking loud enough for Jasmine to hear every word. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. This is clearly a computer error, and I'm willing to compensate you for handling it quietly and professionally. Here's $1,000 to ensure this situation gets resolved appropriately. Clearly, someone made an error in the booking system, Stephanie said, her voice taking on a tone of false reasonableness. Take this money to compensate for any inconvenience while you fix this obvious mistake. Lisa Patel stared at that money, and you could almost see the war happening behind her eyes. Her rational mind knew this was wrong, knew that this innocent girl had done nothing but exist in a space where others didn't think she belonged. But her desperate heart saw rent money, saw her mother's medication, saw her car payment, saw a solution to problems that had been keeping her awake at night for months. From across the aisle, Frank, an elderly white man with silver hair and an expensive watch, muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. Spoiled little princess, doesn't even know she doesn't belong here. His words carried the weight of decades of entitlement, of a man who had lived his entire life in spaces where everyone looked like him. The cruelty of that comment hit Jasmine like a physical blow. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked around the cabin, trying to understand why strangers were saying such hurtful things about her. I can call my parents if something's wrong, she offered desperately, reaching for her phone with trembling hands. They can explain everything. In her innocent mind, she still believed this was all some terrible misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple phone call. She had no framework for understanding that she was experiencing racism, because her parents had worked so hard to protect her from this reality. But then everything changed. Lisa Patel, the one adult who had been defending her, suddenly straightened up and cleared her throat. The money had won. The bills, the pressure, the desperate need for financial relief had corrupted the one person standing between Jasmine and the mob mentality of the first-class cabin. "I'm sorry, sweetie," Lisa said, her voice carefully controlled as she avoided making eye contact with the confused teenager. "But there might be a computer glitch with your seat assignment after all. Let me check the system again." The betrayal hit Jasmine like a sledgehammer. Her young face crumpled with confusion and hurt as she looked up at the woman who had just been defending her. "But you just said I was fine," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You said there was no mistake." The psychological torture of that moment cannot be overstated. This sheltered teenager was watching an adult she had trusted completely change her story right before her eyes, and she couldn't understand why. In her protected world, adults were supposed to be consistent, trustworthy, and safe, but the passengers around her smelled blood in the water. With Lisa Patel's authority now backing their position, they grew bolder, more vicious, more willing to say the quiet parts out loud. Sandra, the corporate executive who had been watching this drama unfold, decided it was time to join the attack. "Some children aren't taught proper travel etiquette. You were asked to leave, but you're still complaining," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "There are certain protocols for different types of passengers." Her words were carefully chosen, coded language that everyone understood but could be defended as not technically racist if anyone called her out. She was a master of corporate speech, of saying horrible things in ways that gave her plausible deniability. Derek Mitchell, another passenger meanwhile, had his phone out and was recording everything. "Black kid meltdown incoming," he whispered to his camera, treating Jasmine's trauma like entertainment content for his social media followers. "This is about to get really interesting." The dehumanization was complete. These adults had reduced a scared, confused teenager to nothing more than content, a source of amusement, a teaching moment for what they saw as an uppity child who needed to learn her place. Stephanie, sensing that momentum had shifted in her favor, reached into her purse again and pulled out another $500. "Handle this appropriately," she said to Lisa Patel, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to buying her way out of problems. Lisa took the money, all $1,500 of it, and slipped it into her uniform pocket. The weight of those bills felt like concrete, like evidence of her moral failure. But the relief of having her financial problems solved was stronger than her conscience. She couldn't look at Jasmine as she pocketed the bribe. She couldn't face the confusion and hurt in those young eyes. Couldn't acknowledge what she had just done to an innocent child for the sake of her own financial survival. Jasmine watched this transaction with growing horror. Even in her sheltered naivety, she understood that money had just changed hands, that she was somehow the subject of a transaction she didn't understand. "I don't understand why everyone's being mean," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The words hung in the air like an indictment of every adult in that cabin. Here was a child, literally asking why the grown-ups around her were being cruel, and not one of them had the decency to feel ashamed. With Lisa Patel now completely compromised and bought off, the other passengers felt emboldened to drop their pretenses entirely. The thin veneer of civilization that had been holding back their ugliest impulses evaporated completely. Frank leaned forward in his seat, his expensive suit and distinguished appearance making his words even more chilling. "Little girl needs to learn how the real world works," he said with the authority of someone who had spent 70 years believing that his comfort was more important than other people's dignity. "This is a valuable lesson." Jasmine looked up at them with tears streaming down her face, her voice barely audible as she tried to defend herself. "I never asked for special treatment," she said, her words breaking apart as she spoke. "I just want to sit in my seat and go home." The innocence in her voice should have melted the hearts of everyone in that cabin. Here was a child who literally didn't understand what she was being accused of, who had no framework for understanding why these adults were treating her like she had committed some terrible crime. But Betty, Frank's wife, chose that moment to add her own venom to the mix. "Children today are so entitled," she said with the dismissive tone of someone who had forgotten what it was like to be young and vulnerable. No respect for authority, no understanding of proper behavior. Derek Mitchell, still recording everything for his social media audience, decided to escalate things even further. "Wait till Daddy hears about this," he mocked, making sure his camera captured Jasmine's tears. "I'm sure he'll have some very interesting explanations for how his little princess ended up in first class." Jasmine, desperate to prove that her parents were good people who had done nothing wrong, pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She tried calling her mother first, then her father, but both calls went straight to voicemail. Unbeknownst to her, her parents were in back-to-back board meetings, their phones silenced as they made decisions that affected thousands of employees. The sight of those failed phone calls sent Stephanie into a frenzy of triumphant cruelty. "Daddy's busy making real money, not charity handouts," she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "Some people work for a living instead of relying on government programs." Jasmine looked up at her with genuine confusion, her tears making it hard for her to see clearly. "Charity? My family isn't poor," she said, her voice small and bewildered. "I don't understand what you mean." The innocence of that response, the genuine lack of understanding, should have been a wake-up call for everyone in that cabin. But Bradley just laughed louder, pointing at her like she was some kind of entertainment. "Sure you're not, princess," he said with mock sympathy. "I'm sure Daddy's very successful at whatever it is he does." Lisa Patel, the weight of her betrayal growing heavier by the minute, made one last weak attempt to salvage something from this situation. "I will get you a comfortable seat in economy," she suggested quietly, her voice barely audible as she avoided looking at Jasmine directly. This hit Jasmine like a physical blow. This woman who had defended her, who had called her sweetie and honey, was now suggesting that she didn't belong where she was sitting. The psychological damage of that betrayal, the complete reversal of support, was devastating to witness. Lisa took her boarding pass and was ready to move Jasmine from her first-class seat to economy so Stephanie could sit. Jasmine's composure finally broke completely. The tears that had been threatening to fall all along came in a flood as she looked around the cabin at all these adults who had decided she was their enemy. "I just want to go home to my dad," she sobbed, her words barely intelligible through her crying. It was the cry of a child who had discovered that the world was far crueler than she had ever imagined, that adults could be monsters, that safety was an illusion, and that sometimes there was no one coming to save you. What none of these passengers realized was that while they were tormenting this innocent teenager, they were creating evidence of their own cruelty. Derek's live stream was being watched by thousands of people, and the comments were starting to turn ugly. But not in the way he expected. And somewhere in Chicago, in a boardroom high above the city, Jasmine's father was about to get a phone call that would change everything. Because this story was far from over, and justice was about to arrive in a way that none of these passengers could have imagined. Have you ever faced discrimination anywhere? Type yes in the comments, share your experience, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. As Jasmine stayed there sobbing, something shifted in the atmosphere of the first-class cabin. The passengers around her began to realize that this wasn't just some teenager putting on an act or trying to manipulate the situation. Her tears were real, her confusion was genuine, and her complete inability to understand what was happening to her was painfully authentic. This realization, however, didn't make them kinder. Instead, it made them crueler. They had discovered that they were dealing with someone who had never experienced this kind of treatment before, someone who had been genuinely sheltered from the harsh realities of prejudice and discrimination. And rather than feeling protective of this innocent child, they saw an opportunity to deliver what they considered a much-needed lesson. Frank, the elderly man who had been muttering cruel comments throughout the flight, leaned forward with a predatory smile. "Never faced reality before, have you?" he said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed he was performing a public service. "Well, welcome to how the world really works, little girl." The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. Here was a grown man, someone's grandfather perhaps, taking pleasure in the psychological destruction of a confused teenager. His words weren't just meant to hurt. They were meant to educate, to strip away her innocence and replace it with the bitter understanding that the world was not the safe place her parents had led her to believe. Sandra, the corporate executive, nodded approvingly and decided to add her own contribution to Jasmine's education. "Welcome to the real world, little girl," she said with false sympathy, as if she were doing Jasmine a favor by crushing her spirit. "Not everyone gets to live in a bubble forever. Some of us understand how society actually functions." The psychological torture was methodical, calculated. These weren't random acts of cruelty born from momentary anger. These were deliberate attempts to break down a child's understanding of safety, fairness, and basic human decency. Jasmine, desperate for some connection to the safety of her family, pulled out her phone with shaking hands and began typing a text message to her parents. Her fingers trembled as she wrote, "Something's wrong. People are being mean to me on the plane. I don't understand what I did. Please call me back." The message was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Here was a child reaching out for help in the only way she knew how, trying to bridge the gap between the cruel reality she was experiencing and the safe world her parents had created for her. Derek Mitchell, who had been recording this entire ordeal for his social media followers, saw Jasmine's desperate texting as fresh content for his livestream. "Spoiled rich brat gets reality check," he announced to his camera, making sure to capture Jasmine's tears and obvious distress. "She's texting mommy and daddy right now, probably asking them to sue the airline or something." His followers were eating it up, filling the chat with laughing emojis and cruel comments about entitled kids and learning lessons the hard way. What Derek didn't realize was that the tide was slowly turning in the comments section, with more and more viewers beginning to question why grown adults were ganging up on what was obviously a scared child. Lisa Patel stood nearby, watching this psychological torture unfold, and the guilt was eating her alive. She could see the genuine terror in Jasmine's eyes, could hear the confusion in her voice, could witness the systematic destruction of this child's innocence happening right in front of her. The $1,500 in her pocket felt like blood money, and every sob from Jasmine was like a knife in her conscience. But she had taken the money. She had made her choice. And now she was trapped, complicit in this cruelty, unable to backtrack without admitting that she had been bribed to turn against an innocent passenger. Bradley, the young trust fund kid who had been finding this situation amusing, decided to add his own psychological assessment to the mix. Blacks shouldn't even be allowed to book a first-class ticket in the first place, even if they can afford it. They don't deserve it. The irony of his comment was staggering. Here was someone who had literally inherited his wealth, making assumptions about another person's character based on nothing more than the color of her skin and his own prejudices. Jasmine looked around the cabin at all these adults who had appointed themselves her judges and jury, and whispered the most heartbreaking question of all. "I just don't understand what I did wrong." The innocence in those words should have stopped everyone in their tracks. Here was a child literally asking what crime she had committed to deserve this treatment. And the answer was nothing. She had done absolutely nothing except exist in a space where others had decided she didn't belong. As the psychological assault continued, Jasmine did what any scared child would do. She reached for the comfort of thinking about her father. "My daddy will understand," she said through her tears, her voice small but carrying a note of hope. "He always knows how to fix things when they go wrong." Stephanie Blackwood heard this and let out a laugh that was pure venom. "What does daddy do? Run a lemonade stand?" she mocked, her voice dripping with contempt. "Let me guess, he's very important in his little world, right? Probably thinks he's some kind of big shot." The cruelty of that moment was breathtaking. Stephanie was mocking a child's love for her father, trying to poison the one source of comfort Jasmine had left. She was attacking not just Jasmine, but the relationship that meant everything to a scared teenager trapped in a nightmare situation. Frank, however, heard something different in her words. "Child labor laws exist for a reason," he said with mock concern. "Sounds like daddy might be exploiting his workers if he's working that hard. Someone should probably look into that." The suggestion was as cruel as it was absurd. Frank was now threatening to have Jasmine's father investigated and arrested based on nothing more than her innocent description of him as a hard worker. The psychological warfare had escalated to threats against her family. It was at this moment that Captain Davis finally made his appearance in the first-class cabin. He had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit, receiving reports from other flight attendants about the disturbance, and he could see immediately that something was very wrong. The captain was a seasoned professional who had seen every kind of passenger dispute imaginable, but the scene before him was unlike anything in his experience. Here was a teenager, clearly in distress, surrounded by adults who seemed to be taking pleasure in her suffering. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded a multi-million-dollar aircraft and the safety of everyone aboard. Lisa Patel, caught between her guilt and her need to justify her actions, tried to explain the situation while avoiding eye contact with both the captain and Jasmine. "There's been a seating issue," she said weakly, her voice lacking any conviction. "We're trying to resolve it appropriately." But Captain Davis was no fool. He had been flying for over 20 years, and he could read a situation better than most people could read a book. "She seems very upset," he observed, looking directly at Jasmine's tear-streaked face. "This doesn't look like a simple seating dispute." Jasmine looked up at the captain with desperate hope. Here was an adult in uniform, someone with authority, someone who might actually listen to her. "I've never been treated like this before," she said, her voice small but clear. "I don't understand why everyone is being so mean to me." The captain's expression darkened as he took in the scene around him. He could see the phones recording, the smug expressions on the passengers' faces, the obvious distress of the teenager, and the guilty look on his flight attendant's face. Something was very wrong here, and he was going to get to the bottom of it. But before he could ask any more questions, another flight attendant appeared at his side with an urgent message. She whispered something in his ear about a call from the cockpit, something about VIP arrival protocol being activated for their destination. Captain Davis nodded and excused himself, but not before giving the first-class cabin one more searching look. He would be back, and when he returned, there would be answers. Stephanie Blackwood watched the captain leave with a satisfied smile. She assumed that her phone calls to her family lawyer had worked, that her connections and influence had finally kicked in to resolve this situation in her favor. "Well," she said with smug satisfaction, "it looks like the proper authorities are finally taking action. This cabin is clearly not for people like her." She was convinced that the VIP protocol was for her benefit, that her family's influence had reached the airline's upper management, and that justice was finally being served. In her mind, she had won, and this uppity child was about to learn a very expensive lesson about knowing her place. But then Jasmine's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. She looked down at her screen, and for the first time since this nightmare began, a small smile crossed her face. The message was simple but filled with love. "Almost there, princess. Dad's waiting for you at the gate. Can't wait to hear about your flight." Jasmine's entire demeanor changed as she read those words. The comfort of knowing her father was waiting, that she would soon be safe in his arms, gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She looked up from her phone, and despite her tears, spoke with a conviction that surprised everyone in the cabin. "See? My daddy's coming to pick me up," she said, showing her phone to anyone who would look. "He's waiting for me at the gate." The innocent hope in her voice was unmistakable. Here was a child who still believed that her father could fix anything, that his presence alone would make all of this cruelty disappear. Betty, Frank's wife, let out a condescending laugh. "How sweet, Daddy to the rescue," she said with the tone of someone speaking to a toddler. Derek Mitchell, still recording everything for his social media audience, saw this as the perfect climax to his content. "This is getting better by the minute," he announced to his camera. "Now we get to meet the parent who raised this entitled little princess. This should be interesting." What none of these passengers realized was that their cruelty was about to come full circle in the most spectacular way possible. They had spent the entire flight tormenting a child, assuming she was powerless, assuming her family was irrelevant, assuming that their wealth and connections made them untouchable. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The VIP protocol that Captain Davis had been informed about wasn't for Stephanie Blackwood or any of her fellow passengers. It was for Jasmine Robinson, daughter of Jonathan Robinson. And when that plane touched down in Chicago, every single person who had participated in her torment was about to face consequences they never could have imagined. Justice was coming. And it was arriving in the form of a father's love and a CEO's power. The plane touched down at Chicago O'Hare with a gentle thud that seemed to echo through the first-class cabin like a death knell. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with an announcement that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at Chicago O'Hare. Please remain seated as we have a special VIP disembarkation procedure in effect. Security personnel will be boarding shortly to escort our VIP passenger." Stephanie Blackwood stood up triumphantly, smoothing down her designer dress and checking her reflection in her phone camera. She was absolutely convinced that her family's connections had finally kicked in, that the airline's upper management had received her calls and decided to handle this situation with the appropriate authority. "Well, it's about time," she declared to the cabin, her voice filled with vindictive satisfaction. "I knew that proper channels would eventually restore order to this flight." Meanwhile, Jasmine sat frozen in her new economy seat, her young mind racing with terrifying possibilities. The only context she had for security meeting a plane was for movies and news stories, and none of those scenarios ended well. "Are they going to arrest me?" she whispered, her voice small and scared. "Did I break some law I don't know about?" The innocence of that question was heartbreaking. Here was a child who had been so psychologically battered by the adults around her that she genuinely believed she might have committed some crime worthy of arrest. Derek Mitchell kept his camera rolling, practically salivating at the prospect of capturing what he assumed would be the ultimate humiliation of this spoiled rich kid. His live stream was now being watched by over 10,000 people, and the comments were a mix of cruel anticipation and growing concern for what appeared to be a terrified teenager. "This is it, folks," Derek whispered to his camera. "The big finale. Security's coming to escort our little princess off the plane. This has been better than reality TV." But then Captain Davis appeared in the first-class cabin, and his demeanor was nothing like what any of the passengers expected. Instead of the stern authority figure coming to remove a problematic passenger, he approached the economy section with the respectful professionalism reserved for the airline's most important customers. "Miss Robinson?" he said gently. his voice carrying none of the disciplinary tone the passengers had been expecting. "Your father's security team is here to escort you to the VIP lounge." But first, she was led back to the first-class lounge. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. "Miss Robinson," not "young lady," or the passenger in question. Miss Robinson, spoken with the kind of respect typically reserved for dignitaries and board members. Stephanie's triumphant smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Finally, proper consequences," she said, though there was now a slight uncertainty in her voice. It's about time someone in authority addressed this situation appropriately. But Jasmine's reaction was completely different from what anyone expected. Instead of fear or defiance, her face lit up with genuine relief and joy. "Daddy sent security? That means everything's okay," she exclaimed, her voice bright with the happiness of a child who finally felt safe again. The contrast was stunning. While the passengers had been interpreting the security presence as punishment, Jasmine understood it as protection, as evidence of her father's love and concern for her well-being. At that moment, the cabin door opened, and what entered was not the rough airport security that the passengers had been expecting. Instead, a team of impeccably dressed professional security personnel walked into first class with the kind of polished professionalism that screamed corporate executive protection. The lead security officer, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit with an earpiece and the bearing of a former military, scanned the cabin briefly before his eyes settled on Jasmine with unmistakable recognition and respect. "Miss Robinson," he said with the gentle tone of someone speaking to their boss's beloved daughter, "your father is waiting for you in the VIP lounge. He was very concerned when he heard about the disturbance on your flight." The words hit the cabin like a freight train. VIP lounge. Not security office, not detention area, not some disciplinary meeting. The VIP lounge, where only the most important people in the airline industry were received. Stephanie's confusion was palpable as she tried to process what she was hearing. VIP lounge? For this child? She sputtered, her carefully constructed worldview beginning to crack around the edges. The security chief's response was gentle but firm as he looked directly at Jasmine. "He wanted me to tell you that everything is going to be all right, and that he's very proud of how you handled yourself today." Jasmine's face broke into the first genuine smile she had worn since the flight began. "I knew Daddy would fix this," she said with the absolute faith of a child who had never been let down by her father's love. Sandra, the corporate executive who had spent the flight delivering cool lectures about reality, was now staring at this professional security detail with growing alarm. "What kind of parent sends private security to pick up their child from a flight?" she asked, though her voice now carried notes of uncertainty rather than contempt. It was Lisa Patel who first began to understand the magnitude of what was happening. As a flight attendant, she recognized the protocols being followed and had seen them used only for the most important passengers the airline served. Her face went white as the implications began to sink in, and her hand instinctively moved to the pocket containing the $1,500 she'd been paid to betray this child. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just any passenger. This was someone so important that the airline's top-tier VIP protocols had been activated. Someone so valued that professional security teams had been dispatched. Someone whose father had enough influence to command this level of attention and respect. As Jasmine stood up from her seat, the transformation in how she was treated was immediate and stunning. The security team moved with the careful precision of people protecting someone precious, someone whose safety and comfort were their top priority. One of the security officers carefully helped her gather her belongings while another maintained a respectful distance, ensuring her privacy and space. It was the kind of treatment typically reserved for heads of state or Fortune 500 CEOs. Frank, the elderly man who had spent the flight delivering cool lectures about reality and proper behavior, finally found his voice. "Who exactly is this child's father?" he asked, though his tone had shifted from condescending authority to genuine bewilderment. Jasmine looked at him with the innocent confusion of someone who didn't understand why this was such an important question. "Jonathan Robinson," she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He owns an airline." The silence that followed was deafening. Not a single person in that cabin moved, breathed, or spoke for what felt like an eternity. Derek Mitchell's phone nearly slipped from his hands as the implications of what Jasmine had just said began to register. "Wait," he whispered to his camera, his voice barely audible. "Did Jonathan Robinson, as in Robinson Airlines, as in the CEO of one of the biggest airline companies in the country?" Jasmine tilted her head with innocent curiosity. "You know my daddy?" she asked, genuinely pleased that these strangers might be familiar with her father's work. Betty, Frank's wife, let out a gasp that echoed through the cabin. "She's the CEO's daughter?" she whispered, her voice filled with the kind of horror reserved for people who realize they've just made a catastrophic mistake. Stephanie Blackwood's face drained of all color as the reality of her situation began to sink in. This wasn't just any child she had been tormenting. This wasn't some scholarship student or charity case. This was the daughter of Jonathan Robinson, one of the most powerful men in the airline industry. Someone whose influence could end careers, destroy reputations, and bankrupt companies. The $1,500 she had paid to Lisa Patel suddenly seemed like the most expensive mistake of her life. She had just spent an entire flight bribing an employee to torment the boss's daughter. As the security team prepared to escort Jasmine from the plane, she looked around the cabin with the innocent confusion of someone who couldn't understand the sudden change in atmosphere. "Why is everyone so quiet now?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a knife. Lisa Patel, her guilt now compounded by the terror of what she had done, pulled the crumpled bills from her pocket with shaking hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, trying to give the money back to Stephanie. "I didn't realize who you were. I would never have. I should never have." But Jasmine looked at her with genuine puzzlement. "Realize what? That I was telling the truth?" she asked, her innocent question highlighting the fundamental cruelty of what had happened. She was pointing out that her identity shouldn't have mattered. She had been telling the truth all along, and that should have been enough. Sandra, the corporate executive who had spent the flight lecturing about reality and proper behavior, was now mentally reviewing every cruel comment she had made about the CEO's child. Her own corporate position suddenly felt very precarious as she realized that her behavior had been recorded and would likely reach the highest levels of the airline industry. Bradley, the young trust fund kid, who had found the whole situation entertaining, was staring at his phone in horror as he realized that his mocking live-stream comments about airline royalty had been recorded for posterity. He had literally mocked the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the industry, and it was all captured on video. Frank sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling as he processed the fact that he had spent the flight teaching lessons to the owner's daughter. Every condescending comment, every cruel lecture about reality and proper behavior had been directed at someone whose father could probably buy and sell him 100 times over. Stephanie, desperate to salvage something from this disaster, tried one last pathetic attempt at damage control. "We were just playing with you," she said weakly, her voice lacking any conviction. "It was all just a misunderstanding, just some harmless teasing between passengers." But Jasmine's response revealed the depth of her dawning understanding. The innocent confusion was slowly being replaced by a more adult comprehension of what had really happened to her. "You were mean to me because you thought my family was poor?" she asked, her voice carrying a new note of hurt that went beyond confusion. She was beginning to understand that their cruelty hadn't been random or accidental. It had been deliberate, calculated, based on assumptions about her worth and value as a human being. The question hung in the air like an indictment, exposing the ugly truth that no one in that cabin wanted to acknowledge. They had tormented a child not because of anything she had done, but because of who they thought she was. They had assumed she was powerless, vulnerable, someone they could attack without consequences. They had been wrong about everything. As the security team gently escorted Jasmine toward the cabin door, she turned back one last time to look at the adults who had made her flight such a nightmare. There was no anger in her eyes, no desire for revenge. Instead, there was something far more powerful and devastating: disappointment. She had learned something terrible about the world that day, something her parents had tried to shield her from for 16 years. She had discovered that some adults could be cruel for no reason other than prejudice, that kindness was not universal, and that safety was not guaranteed. But she had also learned something else. She had learned that she was stronger than she thought, that her father's love could reach her even in the darkest moments, and that truth and justice, while sometimes delayed, would eventually prevail. As she walked off that plane, Jasmine Robinson was no longer the sheltered, innocent child who had boarded in Connecticut. She was someone who had been tested by cruelty and emerged with her dignity intact, someone who had faced hatred and responded with grace. Behind her, she left a cabin full of adults who were about to discover that their actions had consequences, that their cruelty had been witnessed and recorded, and that justice was about to be served by someone with the power to ensure it was both swift and complete. The real reckoning was about to begin. As the security team gently guided Jasmine through the first-class cabin toward the exit, her innocent voice carried one more question that would haunt every passenger who heard it. "Will those people be in trouble?" she asked the security chief, looking back at the adults who had tormented her with genuine concern rather than vindictiveness. Even after everything they had put her through, even after the psychological torture and deliberate cruelty, Jasmine's first thought wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about the welfare of the very people who had tried to destroy her spirit. The purity of that concern, the complete absence of malice in her voice, served as the final indictment of every adult who had participated in her suffering. Meanwhile, Derek Mitchell's phone was buzzing with notifications as his livestream exploded across social media platforms. What had started as his attempt to create entertaining content at a teenager's expense had become a viral sensation, but not in the way he had intended. The video was being shared with captions like, "We tortured the CEO's daughter," and "Watch adults bully child for an hour." The comment section had turned into a digital courtroom where thousands of viewers were expressing their outrage at what they had witnessed. Corporate investigators, airline executives, and legal professionals were already taking screenshots and downloading the footage as evidence of what would become one of the most expensive discrimination cases in airline history. Derek's follower count was indeed exploding, but for all the wrong reasons. Instead of gaining fame as an entertaining content creator, he was becoming infamous as the man who had live-streamed the systematic abuse of a child for profit. Lisa Patel, meanwhile, was facing the immediate termination of her career. Word had already reached the airline's management about her acceptance of bribes to discriminate against a passenger, and the fact that the passenger was the CEO's daughter made her actions not just unethical, but catastrophically stupid. Her supervisor was already on the phone, informing her that her employment was terminated effective immediately and that she would be escorted from the aircraft by airport security. But the consequences extended far beyond just Lisa. Every passenger who had participated in Jasmine's torment was being flagged permanently in the airline's computer system. Stephanie Blackwood, Sandra, Frank and Betty, Bradley, and Derek Mitchell would find themselves banned from flying with any airline in the Robinson network, which included partnerships with dozens of carriers worldwide. Their names were being entered into databases that would follow them for the rest of their lives. As Jasmine walked away from the nightmare she had endured, she turned to the security chief one more time with a request that demonstrated the remarkable character her parents had instilled in her. I don't want them to get fired or lose their jobs, she said softly. They seemed sad and angry about something else. Maybe they just needed help. The security chief looked down at this extraordinary young woman with a mixture of amazement and respect. After everything these people had done to her, she was advocating for their welfare. It was a level of compassion and maturity that most adults never achieved, displayed by someone who was still technically a child. As they walked through the airport toward the VIP lounge, Jasmine's eyes suddenly lit up as she spotted a familiar figure waiting for her. Jonathan Robinson stood near the entrance to the executive area, and despite his position as one of the most powerful men in the airline industry, in that moment he was simply a concerned father waiting for his daughter. "Daddy!" Jasmine cried out, breaking away from the security team and running straight into her father's arms. The relief and joy in her voice echoed through the terminal as she finally felt truly safe again. Jonathan Robinson was a man who commanded boardrooms filled with billionaires, who made decisions that affected millions of travelers, and who wielded influence that could shape entire industries. But as he held his daughter, watching her tears of relief soak into his expensive suit, none of that mattered. He was just a father whose child had been hurt. And the pain in his heart was evident to anyone who saw them together. "People were so mean to me, Daddy," Jasmine said through her tears, her voice muffled against his chest. "But I don't understand why. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just sitting in my seat." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he held her closer, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm his composure. "I'm so sorry you had to experience that, Princess," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No child should ever have to go through what you went through today." As they stood there in the VIP lounge, Jasmine pulled back to look at her father with the earnest confusion that had characterized her entire ordeal. "They thought we were poor, Daddy? Is being poor bad? Are poor people not allowed to fly in nice seats?" The question revealed the depth of her innocence and the extent to which her parents had successfully shielded her from the ugly realities of prejudice and class discrimination. She genuinely didn't understand the concept that someone's economic status could be used to justify treating them as less than human. Jonathan knelt down to his daughter's eye level, choosing his words carefully as he tried to explain concepts that no parent should ever have to discuss with their child. "No, baby," he said gently. "Being poor isn't bad, and everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of how much money they have. But some people think it is, and they use that as an excuse to be cruel to others." Jasmine processed this information with the serious consideration of someone trying to understand a fundamental injustice in the world. Then, true to her character, her next thought was about helping others. The flight attendant who took the money, she seemed like she really needed it. "Can we help her find another job? Maybe she was just scared about paying her bills." Jonathan looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Even after being betrayed by Lisa Patel, even after watching her accept money to turn against her, Jasmine's impulse was to understand and forgive rather than condemn. It was a level of emotional intelligence and compassion that impressed him beyond words. Over the following days, as they spent time together processing what had happened, Jonathan found himself having conversations with his daughter that he had hoped to delay for several more years. He explained prejudice and discrimination in age-appropriate terms, helping her understand that the cruelty she had experienced wasn't random but was based on assumptions people made about her, based on her appearance. "So they were mean to me because of how I look?" Jasmine asked during one of these conversations, her young mind working to understand concepts that adults struggled with. "Some people make wrong assumptions about others based on things like skin color or what they're wearing," Jonathan explained carefully. "They don't take the time to get to know someone as a person before they decide what kind of treatment that person deserves." Jasmine's response was immediate and indignant. "That's not fair," she declared with the moral clarity that only children possess. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just being myself. These conversations led to deeper discussions about privilege, kindness, and the responsibility that comes with having resources and influence. Jonathan helped his daughter understand that while she couldn't control how others treated her, she could control how she treated others, and that their family's wealth came with an obligation to use it in ways that helped, rather than hurt people. "I want to travel with you more often," Jasmine told her father one evening. "I want to see how other people live and learn how to help them. I don't want to be sheltered anymore if it means I don't understand the world." Jonathan realized that his daughter had gained something valuable from her traumatic experience. She had lost some of her innocence, but she had gained wisdom, empathy, and an understanding of social justice that would serve her well throughout her life. Meanwhile, the consequences for the passengers who had tormented Jasmine were swift and severe. Stephanie Blackwood found her reputation destroyed, not just in her professional circles, but in her personal life as well. When the video of her behavior went viral, her own family members publicly distanced themselves from her actions. Her country club revoked her membership, her charity boards asked for her resignation, and her social circle evaporated overnight. The woman who had spent her entire life believing that her family's old money made her superior to others discovered that even privilege had its limits when it came to protecting someone from the consequences of public moral failure. Sandra, the corporate executive who had joined in the attack on Jasmine, found herself facing immediate termination from her position. Her company, which had partnerships with Robinson Airlines, couldn't afford to be associated with someone who had publicly discriminated against the CEO's daughter. Her career in corporate America was effectively over, as no major company would risk hiring someone with her baggage. Frank and Betty, the elderly couple who had felt entitled to teach lessons to a confused teenager, were banned not just from Robinson Airlines, but from several partner carriers as well. Their golden years of comfortable travel came to an abrupt end, replaced by the humiliation of being recognized in airports and asked to leave. Bradley, the trust fund kid who had thought the whole situation was entertaining, discovered that even inherited wealth couldn't protect him from viral infamy. The video of him mocking and laughing at a distressed child spread through social media like wildfire, making him unemployable and socially radioactive. His trust fund might have provided financial security, but it couldn't buy back his reputation. Derek Mitchell, who had live-streamed the entire ordeal for profit, found himself facing potential legal action for filming and distributing footage of a minor without consent. His social media accounts were banned. His content creation career was over, and he was receiving threats from viewers who had been outraged by his behavior. But perhaps the most interesting consequence involved Lisa Patel. Despite her betrayal, Jasmine had specifically asked her father to help the former flight attendant find new employment. Jonathan, moved by his daughter's compassion, arranged for Lisa to receive job placement assistance and financial counseling to help her manage her debts without compromising her ethics in the future. It was a gesture of grace that Lisa would never forget, and it served as a powerful example to Jasmine about the difference between justice and revenge, between holding people accountable and destroying their lives unnecessarily. 6 months after the incident, Jonathan Robinson implemented comprehensive sensitivity training across his entire airline network. The program, developed in consultation with diversity experts and civil rights organizations, became a model for the entire industry and was eventually adopted by airlines worldwide. Jasmine, meanwhile, had begun volunteering at a local community center, working with children from different backgrounds and learning about the challenges faced by families with fewer resources than her own. She discovered that she had a gift for connecting with kids who had experienced discrimination or bullying, and her own experience gave her credibility and empathy that couldn't be taught. The family's travel habits changed as well. Instead of always flying privately or in first class, they began taking commercial flights in various seating classes, giving Jasmine opportunities to interact with people from all walks of life and to practice the lessons she had learned about treating everyone with dignity and respect. The story of Jasmine Robinson's flight had become more than just a tale of revenge or comeuppance. It had become a lesson about character, compassion, and the difference between using power to hurt others and using it to heal the world. And in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms around the world, people were asking themselves a simple but profound question. When faced with the choice between cruelty and kindness, which would they choose? Jasmine Robinson had chosen kindness, even in her darkest moment. And that choice had changed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who heard her story. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.